It was just another ordinary evening in downtown Los Angeles. The streets were packed with people rushing to get home, the sound of car engines and honking horns filling the air. But for Daniel, it was just another night on the cold pavement, trying to make it through another lonely, exhausting day. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the towering buildings, but Daniel barely noticed. He sat huddled in the corner of an alley, his worn-out clothes barely keeping the chill at bay. Beside him, his dog, Sparky, lay curled up on a ragged old blanket. Sparky wasn't just a pet, he was family. He had been with Daniel through it. All through the long nights, the hungry days and the countless struggles of life on the streets. Daniel stroked Sparky's fur gently, whispering soothing words. The dog's tail wagged slightly, the only sign that things weren't completely bleak. Sparky had always been there, the only source of warmth and comfort Daniel had. For years, it was just the two of them against the world. But tonight felt different. The rumble of a motorcycle engine broke through the noise of the city. At first it was distant, almost drowned out by the sounds of traffic. But it grew louder, until the deep growl of the engine was all Daniel could hear. He looked up, his instincts kicking in. This wasn't just any biker. Something about the way the bike was moving caught his attention. It wasn't the sound of someone cruising. It was aggressive, dangerous. The motorcycle appeared around the corner, a sleek black beast cutting through the air. The rider, dressed in leather and wearing a helmet that hid most of his face, was speeding down the street, heading straight for Daniel's alley. Daniel felt a tightening in his chest. He didn't know why, but something told him this wasn't going to be a casual pass-by. The biker skidded to a stop just inches away from where Daniel sat. He revved the engine a few times, and the sound was deafening. For a moment, all Daniel could do was stare at the man. The biker didn't say anything. He just looked down at Daniel and Sparky with a cold, almost amused gaze. "Hey, what's the deal?" Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice steady, but his heart was pounding. Without warning, the biker kicked Sparky, sending the small dog yelping in pain. Daniel froze, his stomach sinking. Sparky scrambled to his feet, limping slightly, but Daniel could see the clear distress in his eyes. "Hey, what the hell is wrong with you?" Daniel yelled, standing up, his fists clenched. The biker laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that made Daniel's blood boil. "Just having some fun, man," the biker said, sneering as he revved the engine. Again. "It's just a dog." The words hit Daniel like a slap in the face. His stomach twisted. How could someone be so cold, so heartless? Sparky was just a dog, sure, but he was more than that to Daniel. He was his family, his lifeline. "Don't you dare touch him again," Daniel warned, his voice shaking with anger but also fear. What could he do? He was just a homeless man, and this guy had power, speed, and cruelty on his side. Without saying another word, the biker gunned the engine and took off, kicking up dust in the air as he sped away, leaving Daniel and Sparky behind in stunned silence. Daniel knelt beside his dog, his hands shaking as he checked to make sure Sparky wasn't seriously hurt. The small dog whimpered but seemed otherwise okay, just scared. Daniel's heart ached as he gently stroked Sparky's head. The biker's words echoed in his mind. "It's just a dog." To him, Sparky was nothing more than a nuisance, a target for his cruelty. But to Daniel, Sparky was everything. As Daniel sat there holding his dog close, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. It was one thing after another, and no matter how hard he tried, it seemed like everything was always just out of reach. How long could he keep going like this? But then, as if the universe had a strange way of answering his prayers, something changed in the air. It wasn't just the hum of the city. It was something else. A figure appeared in the distance, a man on a bike, but this time there was something different about him. He wasn't speeding through the streets, wasn't coming with that same reckless attitude. He was slowing down, taking the time to notice. It was then that Daniel noticed him. Keanu Reeves. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Keanu's bike slowed as he neared Daniel, the sound of the engine purring softly now, a sharp contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. The world seemed to pause, as if the universe had pressed a temporary reset button. Keanu stopped a few feet away, dismounting from his bike with the ease of someone who was used to handling both machines and the unpredictable nature of life. He took a quick glance at the scene. Daniel still crouched down on the pavement, his eyes wide with disbelief, holding Sparky, who was shaking. "Hey," Keanu called out, his voice calm but filled with an unspoken understanding. "Is he okay?" Daniel, still reeling from the biker's attack, could barely find his voice. His throat was tight, his heart racing. I don't know," he stammered, glancing down at Sparky. The little dog was still alive, but his breath came in shallow, nervous bursts, and his eyes reflected the fear he had felt moments earlier. Keanu stepped forward, his eyes locked onto the dog, then to Daniel. Without asking for permission, he crouched down, his hand extending gently toward Sparky. "Can I check him out?" he asked, his tone sincere, not forceful. Daniel nodded numbly, still in shock. Keanu carefully placed his hands on the dog, inspecting Sparky's ribs and legs, checking for any visible injuries. "He'll be okay," Keanu said, offering a small smile. "He's just shaken up. Looks like he just needs some rest." Daniel could hardly believe what he was hearing. The biker had attacked Sparky so mercilessly, and yet here was a stranger, someone he never expected, offering not just kindness, but actual help. It was almost too good to be true. For a moment, Daniel felt a surge of relief, but it was quickly followed by a rush of emotions that he couldn't control. Anger, frustration, helplessness. He was overwhelmed. "I'm sorry." Daniel's voice cracked as he struggled to form the words. "I don't even know what to do anymore. I can't keep going like this." Keanu looked at him, his gaze soft but knowing. "You don't have to keep going alone," he said simply. Daniel blinked, taken aback by the sincerity in Keanu's voice. He had grown so used to feeling invisible, to being treated like a nobody, a nuisance, that the idea of someone famous no less, actually seeing him felt surreal. Keanu's expression shifted. He stood up, brushing the dirt off his pants, and extended his hand to Daniel. "Hey, how about we get Sparky some help? I know a place just down the street." Daniel hesitated. Part of him wanted to refuse. He was so used to rejection, to struggling on his own, but something about Keanu's offer made him feel hopeful. He glanced down at Sparky, who was looking up at him with those trusting eyes, and something inside him broke. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for something better. "Okay," Daniel finally said, his voice barely a whisper. I'll go with you." Keanu nodded, smiling slightly. "Great. Let's get him some rest and we'll figure things out from there." The two of them walked side by side to Keanu's bike, Daniel holding Sparky gently in his arms. The city was still bustling around them, but in that moment, it felt like they were in their own little world, separated from the chaos. Daniel felt a strange mix of gratitude and disbelief. Here he was, a man who had spent so many years surviving on the streets, suddenly given a chance to stand up, to change his life. As they approached Keanu's bike, Daniel felt the weight of everything, every disappointment, every failure, every harsh moment on the street, begin to lift just a little. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He didn't know what Keanu's intentions were, or what kind of help he could offer, but for the first time in a long while, Daniel allowed himself to believe that maybe there was a way out. "Thanks," Daniel said quietly as they got on the bike, Keanu taking the lead. "I don't even know how to thank you." Keanu didn't say anything at first. He just nodded, revving the engine before taking off. The wind rushed by them, but for Daniel, it felt like the first real breath of fresh air he'd taken in years. There was still a long road ahead, but in that moment, for the first time in ages, Daniel felt like he wasn't alone. The wind was cool against Daniel's face as they sped through the city streets, Keanu's bike cutting through the traffic with ease. Daniel held on to Sparky tightly, his heart still racing from everything that had just happened. Despite the shock and chaos of the past few minutes, there was something strangely comforting about the ride. The gentle rumble of the engine beneath, him, the clear night sky above, and the feeling that for once someone cared enough to step in. It wasn't long before they reached a small, tucked-away veterinary clinic just off a side street. The neon sign outside flickered slightly, casting a soft glow over the building. Keanu parked the bike in front of the clinic, and Daniel felt a rush of relief. It was a quiet place, not flashy, but the kind of place that seemed to care more about the animals than the paycheck. "Stay here," Keanu said, looking back at Daniel as he dismounted. "I'll go inside and let them know. We're coming." Daniel nodded numbly. Sparky, still in his arms, looked up at him with trusting eyes. For a moment it felt like the world had slowed down. The anger and fear from earlier had started to fade into the background, replaced by a quiet sense of hope. Maybe things could change. Maybe this was the turning point. Keanu returned quickly, holding the door open for Daniel. "Let's get him." Inside. The inside of the clinic was calm and smelled faintly of antiseptic, but it was clean, welcoming. A small receptionist desk was tucked in the corner, and an older woman sat behind it, flipping through paperwork. She looked up when she saw them enter, her eyes softening when she noticed Sparky in Daniel's arms. "Oh my, what happened to him?" the woman asked, standing up quickly, concern etched on her face. "Some guy kicked him," Daniel explained, his voice shaky, still recovering from the earlier shock. I don't know if he's okay, but he's been limping and—" Keanu stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Daniel's shoulder. "We just need to make sure he's all right," he said, his calm voice a stark contrast to Daniel's. "Distress. Can you help him?" "Of course," the woman said, nodding immediately. "Bring him on in." She led them into a small examination room, where Daniel carefully placed Sparky on the table. The little dog, though scared, didn't struggle. His body was still tense, but he trusted Daniel completely. As the woman examined Sparky, Keanu remained silent, standing back but watching closely. His presence was steady, reassuring. Daniel found himself glancing at Keanu more than once, surprised at how much comfort he drew from this stranger, this Hollywood star who had done more for him in a few minutes than anyone else had done in years. After a few minutes of checking Sparky's limbs and body, the woman nodded. "Nothing appears broken, thank goodness. A few bruises and some soft tissue damage, but with rest and some medication, he'll be back on his feet in no time." Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. His shoulders sagged with relief, and a wave of gratitude washed over him. "Thank you," he whispered, feeling the tears that had been building up start to press against his eyes. Keanu gave a small smile, his voice warm, as he addressed the receptionist. "How much for the treatment?" The receptionist glanced at the computer screen before looking back up, her face softening. "Don't worry about it, it's on the house." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "No, I can't let you do that," he protested. "I don't have money," Keanu waved a hand dismissively. "It's not a problem, we're just glad to help." The woman smiled kindly, but her expression was serious. It's rare to see someone care so much for an animal. And the dog looks like he's been through a lot. This is the least we can do. Daniel didn't know what to say. He'd lived on the streets for so long, surviving off scraps, relying on kindness that was often fleeting, that the idea of receiving help, real help, was almost too much to comprehend. "You really didn't have to do this," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. Keanu's voice cut through his rambling. "It's all right. You're not alone. You and Sparky deserve more than just the bare minimum." Daniel nodded, swallowing hard as he tried to regain some composure. The words felt almost foreign coming from Keanu, but they were exactly what he needed to hear. It was like a tiny spark had been lit, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like there might be a way out of the cycle of despair that had kept him trapped. Sparky let out a soft whine, and Daniel's attention snapped back to the dog. The little guy was still shaken, but the worst of it seemed to have passed. Daniel could see the love and loyalty in Sparky's eyes, and it made his chest ache with tenderness. This dog, this beautiful, loyal creature, had been through so much with him, and now maybe they had a shot at something better. Keanu turned to Daniel, his face softening. "Why don't you rest here for a while? I've got a place nearby, and it looks like you both could use some sleep. You've been through a lot today." Daniel hesitated, but the kindness in Keanu's offer was too genuine to refuse. He looked down at Sparky, then back at Keanu, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to repay you." You don't have to, Keanu said with a smile. Just take care of each other. That's enough for me. And for the first time in years, Daniel believed that maybe, just maybe, he could start doing that. The warm, dim light from the clinic's small waiting room made it feel almost like a dream. The soft hum of the air conditioning was a welcome sound compared to the noise of the street, and the sense of calm of being taken care of was something Daniel hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't the usual rush of trying to survive, the daily grind that had become his only reality for so long. This place, this moment felt different. It felt like the possibility of a fresh start. Keanu sat across from him, casually leaning back in a chair, a quiet presence. Despite the casual demeanor, Daniel could sense a depth to the man that went beyond the surface. There was no hurry to leave, no push for answers. He wasn't asking about Daniel's past, his struggles, or why he had ended up on the streets. He was just there, offering a space of safety, an unexpected kindness. As they waited for the vet to finish checking on Sparky, Daniel couldn't help but feel a strange sense of guilt creeping in. Keanu had done more for him in a few hours than most people had done in years, and yet Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he was just some kind of burden, an outsider in a world that had long forgotten people like him. Keanu must have sensed the hesitation in Daniel's demeanor because he spoke up, his voice soft but clear. You know, you're not the first person I've met who's been through something like this. It's easy to feel lost, especially when the world feels like it's against you. But that doesn't mean you're stuck here forever. Daniel looked up, surprised by the honesty in Keanu's words. You think there's a way out?" he asked, his voice quiet. It was hard to believe, hard to let the possibility of a better life creep into his mind. After all, he had spent so long just surviving, so many years caught in a loop of barely getting by. Keanu nodded slowly, his expression serious. "I do. I know it's hard, but it's about finding that one person who will remind you that you're more than your circumstances. And maybe right now that person is me." The words struck Daniel in a way he hadn't expected. No one had ever said anything like that to him before. No one had ever made him feel like he was worth more than his worst days. Keanu was offering hope, genuine raw hope. Before Daniel could respond, the door to the back room opened and the receptionist appeared. She gave a soft smile as she approached them. "Sparky is good to go. He's just a little bruised, but there's nothing serious. We'll give him some pain relief and he should be good in a few days." Daniel's heart lifted at the news. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you so much." Keanu stood up as the receptionist brought Sparky out to them, his tail wagging weakly but still with that familiar spark of joy. Daniel felt a sense of relief wash over him as he gently took Sparky into his arms again. The dog was a little groggy, but he was alive, and that was all that mattered. "We're just happy to help," the receptionist said with a smile. "You're welcome here anytime." As they left the clinic, Keanu gave Daniel a look, a quiet reassurance that made Daniel feel less alone in that moment. Keanu's bike sat just outside, waiting for them. Daniel hesitated for a second, looking down at Sparky, then back at Keanu. The thought of taking a ride, of leaving the only life he'd known for so long, was terrifying. But at the same time, the possibility of something better, of escaping this life of survival and fear, was almost too much to ignore. "You really think I can do this?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with doubt. Keanu looked at him, and for the first time there was a warmth in his eyes that went beyond kindness. "You already are, man. One step at a time." The words sank deep into Daniel's chest. He had been surviving for so long, just getting by, not realizing that living was something else entirely. It wasn't about just fighting day to day. It was about choosing to move forward, about taking that first step into something new, something unknown. With a deep breath, Daniel nodded. "Okay, let's do this." Keanu gave him an approving nod. "Let's go." The ride felt different this time. It wasn't just the wind in his hair or the hum of the engine beneath him. It was something deeper, a sense that this wasn't just a ride to somewhere unknown. This was a ride toward possibility, toward a new life. As they rode through the streets of Los Angeles, Daniel couldn't help but feel that the city, which had once felt so cold and indifferent, now seemed full of potential. For the first time in years, the weight of despair lifted from his shoulders, replaced by something he hadn't dared feel in so long: hope. The city lights of Los Angeles sprawled before them like a sea of stars, each flickering in the distance with its own promise of something bigger. As Keanu's bike hummed steadily along, Daniel felt something unfamiliar stirring within him. He had always been focused on survival, always keeping his head down, avoiding anything that might distract him from the harsh reality he had grown used to. But now, as the cold night air rushed past, he realized that his world was shifting, and it wasn't as terrifying as he had imagined. Keanu's bike pulled up to a modest apartment building, a far cry from the mansions and glitzy condos one might associate with Hollywood. It was an older building with a few plants hanging from the windows and a quiet calm about it, the kind of place that felt lived in, grounded and stable. "Welcome to my place," Keanu said with a grin as he shut off the engine and dismounted. Daniel stood still for a moment, staring at the building. He didn't know what he had expected, but somehow this felt more real than any extravagant celebrity home he had ever imagined. There was something about its simplicity that put him at ease. Maybe it was the thought that someone like Keanu, with all his fame and fortune, could choose a life that wasn't about show. That made Daniel feel like maybe, just maybe, he could choose something better for himself too. Keanu led the way to a door on the second floor, the old wood creaking underfoot as they climbed the stairs. Daniel followed silently, still carrying Sparky, whose head was resting on his shoulder as the dog drowsed peacefully. For a moment he could almost forget where he was, could almost convince himself that this was his new normal, a new life. When they entered the apartment, Daniel was surprised by how cozy it felt. The space wasn't large, but it was filled with natural light from large windows, and there were bookshelves along the walls, some with old records, and a couple of movie posters that hinted at Keanu's love for classic films. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it felt lived in and cared for. Keanu gestured for Daniel to sit on the couch, and he did, his movements slow as he adjusted Sparky so the dog could rest more comfortably in his lap. Keanu walked into the kitchen, pulling out a couple of bottles of water from the fridge. He handed one to Daniel, who took it gratefully, the cool liquid helping to settle his nerves. "Here," Keanu said, sitting across from him. "Take a deep breath. You've been through a lot tonight." Daniel took a long drink, feeling the weight of everything beginning to catch up with him. His heart still raced a little from the adrenaline, but there was something grounding about being in this space, surrounded by calm. Keanu's presence wasn't loud or demanding. It was steady, like a lighthouse on the shore, offering direction, without pushing. It was a strange feeling for Daniel, who was used to people being impatient with him, or worse, ignoring him completely. "I've spent so long just trying to get by, Keanu," Daniel said softly, looking down at Sparky, who was now curled up contentedly in his lap. "I don't even know what it feels like to have someone believe in me, or to think there's more than just surviving." Keanu's gaze softened, and he leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to live just to survive, Daniel. You deserve more than that. And it's not about where you've been, it's about where you choose to go next." Daniel looked up at him, surprised by the strength in his words. He had heard similar things before, but never from someone who didn't expect anything in return. It wasn't some motivational speech. It was a quiet truth, something he could feel deep in his bones. Keanu wasn't talking down to him. He wasn't offering empty platitudes. He was telling him plainly that he was worthy of a better life. "I don't know if I can just choose to do that," Daniel admitted, the doubt creeping back into his voice. "It's hard when you've been stuck for so long. I don't know where to even begin." "You've already begun, Daniel," Keanu said, standing up and moving to the window, his back to Daniel for a moment. "Just being here, just deciding. To take a step forward, that's more than a lot of people ever get to." Daniel let out a breath, feeling the weight in his chest lift just a little. He wasn't sure what this moment was, but it felt like the first piece of a puzzle he had been trying to solve for years. Keanu turned back to face him, his expression serious. "The thing is, no one can give you a perfect life. But I can offer you a chance to find something that's worth fighting for, even if it's small at first." Daniel nodded slowly, not fully understanding what that would mean, but the sense that something had changed in him, something small but significant, was undeniable. He wasn't ready to make grand decisions or figure it all out right this second, but for the first time he could see the faint outline of a possibility, something more than just getting by. The apartment was quiet for a moment, and Daniel let the calmness of it all wash over him. He felt safe for the first time in years. Not just physically safe, but emotionally safe. There was no rush, no judgment. Keanu had simply shown him a glimmer of hope, a reminder that it was never too late to make a change. "Thanks," Daniel whispered, looking at Keanu. "For everything." Keanu's smile was soft but warm, a simple nod in return. "You don't need to thank me. Just take care of yourself, and remember, you don't have to do it alone." As the night wore on, Daniel felt himself slowly starting to unwind. He wasn't sure what the future held, but in that moment, surrounded by kindness and possibility, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of peace. Days passed, and the weight of Daniel's old life seemed to be slowly lifting. Keanu had kept his word, offering a safe place, a steady routine, and more importantly, patience. Every morning, Daniel would wake up to the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen, a simple reminder that the world could still be kind, despite everything. He would take Sparky for short walks, the dog's limping step gradually improving, and he could feel a sense of normalcy creeping back into his life. But while things were better than they had been, they weren't perfect, not by a long shot. One morning, Daniel woke up with a pit in his stomach. He wasn't sure why it was there, but it felt heavy. After a quick shower and a cup of coffee, he sat down at the small kitchen table, staring at the wall in front of him. For the first time in a while, his mind was flooded with doubt, with the familiar anxiety that always seemed to surface when he thought about the future. "I don't know how to do this," he muttered to himself, more to the silence of the room than anyone else. "I don't know how to change." Keanu had told him to take it slow, that he didn't need to rush, but the old habits were hard to shake. Daniel had spent most of his life hustling to survive, running from one problem to the next, never stopping to think about what came next. Now that he was here, in this strange new reality, where things were starting to feel safe, he couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. The sound of footsteps broke him from his thoughts. Keanu appeared in the doorway, looking as calm and collected as usual, though there was a slight concern in his eyes when he saw Daniel's expression. "Everything okay?" Keanu asked, his voice gentle, but filled with the unmistakable care that Daniel had come to appreciate. Daniel rubbed his face, trying to shake the weight of the thoughts crowding in his mind. "I don't know, I feel like I'm just stuck, you know? I don't know how to go from this place, this life I'm living now, to something better." Keanu leaned against the doorframe, studying Daniel for a moment. "I know it's not easy," he said quietly, "and I know it feels like it's too much sometimes. But this is exactly what we talked about, right? It's not about making everything perfect overnight. It's about finding a path and taking small steps forward." Daniel shook his head, frustration creeping into his voice. "I don't know if I even know what a path looks like. I've spent so many years just trying to survive. Every time I think I'm getting somewhere, I hit a wall. What if I can't do it? What if this is all I'm meant to be?" Keanu didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped into the room, sitting down across from Daniel at the kitchen table. His eyes softened with understanding. "I get it, I really do. But you're not alone in this, Daniel. I've been through my own struggles too. The key isn't avoiding the hard stuff. It's facing it head on, even when it feels impossible." Daniel looked up, meeting Keanu's steady gaze. "But what if I fail?" Keanu's expression didn't change, but there was a quiet strength in his voice when he answered. "Failure isn't the end, Daniel. It's just part of the process. It's about getting back up every time you fall, no matter how hard it gets. It's about learning to keep moving, even when you don't have all the answers. I won't tell you it's going to be easy, but I'll tell you it's going to be worth it." The words hung in the air, settling into the space between them. For a moment, Daniel felt something shift. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a crack in the wall he'd built up around himself. For the first time in a long while, He let himself feel something other than fear. "I've been running for so long," Daniel said quietly, almost to himself. "I don't know how to stop." Keanu leaned forward slightly, his voice softer now. "It's okay, you don't have to stop all at once, but you can start. One step at a time." Daniel let out a breath, his heart still heavy but a little lighter than before. He didn't have all the answers, but Keanu's words had given him something he hadn't had in years, a chance to believe in the possibility of a different life. Not a perfect one, not an easy one, but one that could be his. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. Keanu stood up and walked over to answer it, and Daniel stayed at the table, his mind still swirling with everything Keanu had said. But then Keanu's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Daniel," Keanu called from the doorway, "you're going to want to hear this." Daniel stood up, a little confused, and walked over to the door. Keanu was talking to a man in a suit, someone Daniel hadn't seen before, but the man's serious expression immediately caught his attention. "Who's this?" Daniel asked, eyeing the man warily. The man extended his hand, his grip firm but not unkind. "I'm Mike Donovan. I'm here on behalf of an organization that helps people get back on their feet. We've been following your story and wanted to offer you an opportunity." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of opportunity?" Mike glanced at Keanu, then back at Daniel. "A chance for a fresh start, a job, a place to live. It's not charity, but a real chance for you to rebuild. We've helped people in situations similar to yours, and we think you have what it takes." Daniel was stunned. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. This was exactly the kind of thing he had always dreamed of but never thought he would get. "A real chance? Are you serious?" Daniel asked, the words feeling almost too big to say. Mike nodded, his expression earnest. "It's yours if you want it. All you have to do is take the first step." Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, his mind racing. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment, the one where everything could change. But now that it was here, he wasn't sure he was ready. Was he really ready to take that first step? Keanu stood beside him, his expression calm. "You've already started, Daniel. This is just the next step." Daniel swallowed hard, his heart pounding. The fear was still there, but for the first time, the possibility of something better seemed within reach. Taking a deep breath, he nodded. "It's okay, I'll do it." And in that moment, Daniel knew that no matter how difficult the journey ahead might be, he wasn't facing it alone. Not anymore. The days that followed felt like a blur. Daniel couldn't shake the overwhelming mixture of excitement and anxiety that bubbled within him. The offer from Mike Donovan was a golden ticket, something he had never imagined would come his way. It was a chance to escape the street life, to take control of his future in a way that didn't involve scraping by day, a job, a place to live, stability. All the things Daniel had dreamed of but had always thought were out of reach, but despite the opportunity before him, the fear lingered. What if he failed? What if he couldn't adjust? The questions gnawed at him as he sat in the small living room of Keanu's apartment, his hands trembling slightly as he ran them through Sparky's fur. The dog, blissfully unaware of the whirlwind of thoughts in Daniel's mind, nuzzled up to him, offering an anchor in the midst of his storm. Keanu had been nothing but supportive, offering words of encouragement and reminding Daniel that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was worth it. Yet even Keanu's calm presence couldn't erase the fear that was settling deep in Daniel's chest. This was a big leap, one that felt as though he was stepping into the unknown. "You're overthinking it," Keanu said one evening as they sat on the couch. "You've already come so far just by being here. This next step isn't as big as it feels." Daniel looked at Keanu, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You make it sound easy," Keanu chuckled. "It's not easy. Nothing worth having is. But it's about trusting yourself. If you want to go forward, you've got to make the leap." That was the thing Daniel couldn't quite grasp. How could he trust himself when he had spent so much time just getting by, never making real decisions about his future? Every time he had tried to take a step forward in the past, something had always pulled him back, whether it was bad luck, poor decisions, or the harsh reality of his life on the streets. But now, there was something different. There was a chance, not just to survive, but to truly live. The next day, Mike Donovan met Daniel at the coffee shop where they'd initially connected. He was seated at a table in the corner, a folder of papers in front of him, looking like someone who had done this before. When Daniel walked in, Mike stood and gave him a warm smile, motioning for him to sit down. "Good to see you again," Mike said. "Ready to take the next step?" Daniel hesitated for a moment, his mind running through 100 different thoughts, but then he remembered Keanu's words. "Trust yourself. Take the leap." "I think so," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his chest. He sat down across from Mike, trying to calm his nerves. "I've never done anything like this before." Mike's smile didn't falter. "That's okay, it's a big change, but you're not alone in this. We'll be with you every step of the way." Mike pushed the folder toward Daniel, and he could see that it was filled with paperwork. There were forms for a new job, a housing assignment, and even an orientation schedule for a life skills class that would help him adjust to a new routine. Daniel's stomach tightened as he looked at the documents. This was real. This wasn't a fantasy or a dream. This was the chance he had been waiting for, the one he had been too afraid to believe in. "Take your time," Mike said, sensing Daniel's hesitation. "There's no rush." Daniel ran his hand through his hair, glancing at the forms. He felt a weight in his chest, a pressure building. It was all happening too fast. Could he do this? Could he really leave behind the life he had known and step into something new, something better? Or would it all fall apart like so many things had in the past? He thought of Sparky. He thought of Keanu. He thought of the possibility of a life where he wasn't just existing but living, really living. And for the first time, Daniel realized that the fear wasn't about the unknown. The fear was about staying stuck. Taking a deep breath, Daniel nodded, his hands no longer trembling as he reached for the pen. "I'm ready," he said, his voice more sure than he felt. Mike smiled, leaning back in his chair. "That's what I like to hear." It felt surreal as Daniel signed the paperwork, each line a promise to himself that he would take this chance no matter how uncertain the road ahead seemed. The weight of the moment hung in the air, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Daniel didn't feel alone. He felt like he was part of something that had the potential to change everything. Once the papers were signed, Mike stood and shook Daniel's hand firmly. "We'll start with some orientation and training," Mike said. "You'll have a place to stay, a job to get started with. It won't be easy, but I know you've got the strength to do it." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he stood up, his legs a little shaky. He felt a whirlwind of emotions, but beneath it all there was a steady feeling, a glimmer of hope. He had taken the leap. There was no turning back now, but that was okay. For the first time in a long time, Daniel was choosing to believe that something better was possible. That evening, as Daniel sat on the couch in Keanu's apartment, he felt the weight of the day settle into his bones. His heart was still racing, but in a different way now. There was excitement. There was possibility. Keanu looked at him from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel after finishing the dishes. "Well, how was it?" he asked, his voice calm and easy. Daniel looked up at him, a smile spreading across his face, the first real smile he'd had in a long time. "It's happening, Keanu. I'm doing it." Keanu walked over, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "I knew you would. You've got this, man." In that moment, Daniel realized something profound. It wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about having all the answers. It was about taking that first step into the unknown, trusting that the ground would be there to catch him. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt like he was finally ready to stop running. The next few weeks passed in a blur of new beginnings and uncomfortable adjustments. Daniel had entered a world that felt both foreign and welcoming, filled with the promise of a fresh start. The job Mike had arranged for him wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work, something Daniel hadn't had in years. He spent his days working at a warehouse, organizing shipments and managing inventory, tasks that were surprisingly therapeutic. The physical labor kept his mind occupied, and the steady rhythm of the work gave him a sense of accomplishment that he had long forgotten. VI Housing situation was even more of a shift. Daniel moved into a modest apartment, far removed from the chaos of the street life he had known. The walls were bare, the rooms quiet and clean. There was a sense of stability in the place, and for the first time, Daniel could see the possibility of making it feel like home. But it wasn't easy. The silence felt almost oppressive, the freedom overwhelming. He wasn't used to being alone in a space like this, not used to not having to fight for every inch of his life. Keanu checked in on him regularly, offering quiet support and guidance when Daniel would call him with questions about adjusting to his new routine. But despite the help, Daniel still found himself struggling, battling the overwhelming sense of doubt that clung to him like a shadow. One evening after a long day at the warehouse, Daniel sat in his new apartment, staring at the blank walls. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something was missing, that no matter how far he came from the streets, a part of him was still stuck there. He rubbed his eyes, trying to push the anxiety away, but it lingered. Sparky lay beside him on the couch, his head resting on Daniel's lap, and for a moment, Daniel let the comfort of the dog's presence ease his thoughts. But then his phone buzzed. He picked it up, surprised to see Keanu's name on the screen. "Hey, man," Daniel answered, his voice tired. "Hey, you still alive?" Keanu joked on the other end of the line. "You okay?" Daniel sighed. "Yeah, I'm okay. Just thinking. Trying to figure out if I'm really cut out for all of this, you know?" There was a pause before Keanu spoke again, his tone more serious than before. "I get it, man. Change is tough. I'm not going to lie to you. But you're doing it. Every single day. That's more than a lot of people ever do. I don't." "No," Daniel said quietly. "Sometimes I just feel like I'm pretending, like I'm not really meant to be in this world. I'm not used to having a steady job. I don't know how to live like this." Keanu's voice softened, but his words were firm. "You don't have to be perfect, Daniel. No one expects you to have it all figured out, but you're already doing better than most people who start from where you were. You're not pretending. You're just learning to live in a new way, and it's going to take time." Daniel didn't know how to respond to that. It was hard to wrap his head around the idea of learning how to live a different way. It wasn't like riding a bike or learning a new skill. It was deeper than that. He wasn't just adjusting to a new routine, he was adjusting to an entirely new way of thinking, a new perspective on life that didn't involve fighting for survival at every corner. And that was terrifying. He leaned back against the couch, looking at Sparky, who was now snoring softly. "What if I mess it up, Keanu? What if this whole thing just falls apart?" "Then you get back up," Keanu said, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "You don't just give up. You get back up, and you keep going. That's what this is all about. It's not about being perfect, it's about moving forward no matter what. You've got the strength to do it. Don't forget that." Daniel sat in silence, letting the words sink in. Keanu was right. He didn't need to have it all figured out. He just needed to keep moving forward. It wasn't going to be easy. In fact, it was going to be incredibly difficult at times. But the only way to find out if he could do it was to try, to keep trying, no matter how many times he stumbled along the way. "Thanks, Keanu," Daniel said quietly, his voice filled with a gratitude he couldn't fully express. "You're welcome. And remember, I'm just a phone call away. You're not in this alone." After they hung up, Daniel felt a little lighter, a little less burdened by the weight of his doubts. Keanu had a way of putting things into perspective, of reminding him that he was moving forward, even when it felt like he was standing still. And maybe that was all he needed to hear, to know that he didn't have to do this alone. The next morning, Daniel woke up with a new resolve. He might not have all the answers, but he didn't need them right now. He just needed to keep going. He got dressed, fed Sparky, and made his way to the warehouse, determined to do his best that day. At work, he found a rhythm that felt natural. The tasks were routine, and as he moved through them, he realized something important. He wasn't just getting through the day, he was building a life. Slowly but surely, he was creating something that felt like it could be permanent, something that could last. And when he came home that evening, something unexpected happened. The silence in his apartment didn't feel oppressive anymore. It felt like space, room for him to grow, room for him to figure out who he really was without the weight of his past holding him back. Sparky trotted over to him as he sat down on the couch, nudging his hand with his nose. Daniel laughed softly, scratching behind the dog's ears. For a moment, everything felt right. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy. But for the first time in a long time, Daniel allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was finally where he was meant to be. Daniel's life had changed more in the past few months than he could have ever imagined. Every day he felt himself becoming more comfortable with the rhythm of his new life, a life he had once thought was beyond his reach. But as much as he was adjusting, the final test was coming, facing the demons of his past and truly letting go of the life that had once defined him. It was a Thursday afternoon when Daniel got the call. Mike Donovan's voice was on the other end, calm but direct. "Daniel, I need to talk to you about something," Mike said. "There's an opportunity for growth at the warehouse. A supervisor position just opened up. I thought of you right away." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. A supervisor position? Was he ready for that? A part of him wanted to decline, to stay in his comfortable routine, the one that felt familiar and safe. But then he remembered Keanu's words. "It's about moving forward. You've got the strength to do it." He had been offered the chance to live differently, to take control of his future. But the next step would require even more courage than he had already mustered. Taking the supervisor position meant stepping out of his comfort zone, learning new skills, taking on more responsibility. "I'll do it," Daniel said, before he could second-guess himself. The decision felt like a leap off a cliff, but instead of falling, Daniel felt as though he was soaring. In that moment he knew that he wasn't just surviving anymore, he was thriving. The next week, Daniel began his training for the supervisor position. It was a steep learning curve, but he found that the skills he had learned during his time at the warehouse were already laying a solid foundation. He adapted quickly to the new role, gaining the trust of his co-workers and proving to himself that he was capable of more than he ever thought possible. Every time he faced a challenge, he didn't back down. Instead, he tackled it head-on, remembering all the times in his life when he had fought just to survive, and how for the first time he wasn't just fighting, he was building. Through it all, Sparky remained by his side, a constant source of companionship and comfort. The little dog, once a stray and abandoned, had become his rock. And in many ways, Sparky's loyalty and unconditional love reminded Daniel of the lessons he was still learning, that life wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up, being present, and trying your best every day. One evening, after a long shift, Daniel found himself sitting on the steps of his apartment building, Sparky curled up beside him. The world around him had quieted down, and, for the first time in a long time, Daniel allowed himself to just breathe. He thought about everything he had been through, the hardship, the moments of doubt, the fear, and the pain. He thought about the times he had wanted to give up, to go back to the life he had known, the one where nothing was expected of him. But then he thought about the way things were now, the job, the apartment, the friendships he had formed, and, most importantly, the hope that had begun to blossom in his heart. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt like he had a future. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't guaranteed. But it was his, and that was enough. The next day, Daniel walked into the warehouse with a renewed sense of purpose. Mike had given him a small team to manage, and today would be the first day he was fully in charge. The nerves were there, but they were different this time, more like excitement than fear. As he walked to the office to gather some paperwork, he saw a familiar face across the warehouse floor, Keanu. The two of them had stayed in touch over the past few months, and Keanu had always been a phone call away whenever Daniel needed advice or a friend to lean on. Keanu spotted him and waved, making his way over with a wide grin on his face. "You ready for this?" Keanu asked, his tone filled with playful confidence. Daniel grinned back. "I think so." Keanu gave him a thumbs up. "I knew you had it in you. It's been amazing watching you grow, man. Keep it up." "Thanks, Keanu," Daniel said, his voice sincere. "I couldn't have done it without you." Keanu shrugged, a modest smile on his face. "You did the work. I just helped you see. It was possible." Daniel nodded, his chest swelling with pride. The road to this point hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. And as he looked around the warehouse, he realized that he was no longer just a part of the machinery. He was now shaping it. He was part of something bigger than himself. The day passed in a whirlwind of tasks, conversations, and decisions. It was hard work, but Daniel found himself thriving in the chaos. He made mistakes, of course, but he learned from each one, and slowly he gained the respect of his team. When the shift ended, he sat down in the small break room, his mind buzzing with the day's events. He felt good, really good. It wasn't just the work that had changed him, it was the belief he now had in himself. He had come a long way from the days of being a homeless man on the streets. Now he had a job, an apartment, friends who cared about him, and most importantly, hope. Sparky curled up at his feet as he leaned back in the chair, feeling the weight of everything he had accomplished settle into his bones. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, Daniel was no longer afraid of the future. He was ready to face it, head on. As he left the warehouse that evening, walking into the cool night air, he looked up at the stars. He felt like they were shining just a little bit brighter tonight. For the first time, Daniel believed that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward even when things get tough?